Chicago was alive with the hum of activity on a chilly Monday morning. The streets buzzed with people rushing to work, cars honking impatiently, and the distant sound of construction echoing through the city. Among the towering skyscrapers stood Apex Logistics, one of the largest supply chain companies in the world. Its headquarters gleamed under the early sunlight, but behind those glass walls, something felt off. James Whitaker, the CEO of Apex Logistics, sat alone in his office late. Sunday night, he wasn't poring over spreadsheets or reviewing quarterly reports. Instead, he stared at an email thread filled with complaints from warehouse employees. Words like overworked, unfair treatment, and unsafe conditions jumped out at him. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were patterns, repeated across multiple locations. James had built this company from scratch. He prided himself on being a leader who cared about his employees. But now, reading these messages, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere along the way, things had gone terribly wrong. How could he have missed this? Was it possible that the very foundation of his empire was cracking under pressure? Instead of calling another meeting or delegating the issue to HR, James decided to take matters into his own hands. He didn't want filtered reports or polished presentations. He needed raw, unfiltered truth. And so a plan began to form in his mind. A bold, risky plan. The next morning, James woke up earlier than usual. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Gone was the neatly trimmed beard and tailored suit that screamed, CEO. In their place was a clean-shaven face, thick-rimmed glasses, and clothes that hadn't seen an iron in weeks. His polo shirt was faded, his jeans slightly baggy, and his sneakers scuffed enough to blend in with any blue-collar worker. He smiled faintly. No one would suspect a thing. Not even his closest colleagues knew what he was about to do. James grabbed a fake ID card labeled Jake Miller and headed to one of the busiest warehouses in the suburbs. This particular facility processed thousands of shipments daily, making it a critical part of the company's operations. If there were problems here, they'd be impossible to hide. When he arrived, the parking lot was already packed with trucks and forklifts zipping around. Workers milled about, drinking coffee and chatting before the day officially began. James parked his car far from the entrance just in case anyone might recognize his luxury sedan, and walked toward the building. Inside, the air was cool but tinged with the smell of cardboard and machine oil. The noise hit him first. The clatter of metal shelves, the whirring of conveyor belts, and the constant chatter of voices giving instructions. It was chaotic, yet strangely rhythmic. At the time clock station, James hesitated briefly before swiping his fake ID. The screen flashed green, signaling approval. He exhaled quietly, relieved that his cover hadn't been blown yet. As he stepped onto the warehouse floor, he felt a mix of excitement and nerves. What would he find here? Would anyone notice he didn't belong? His first task was simple: sorting, inventory. Boxes upon boxes lined the shelves, each marked with barcodes and labels. James joined a group of workers organizing items based on size and weight. At first, no one paid much attention to him. They assumed he was just another tempie, worker sent to fill in during the busy season. But as the hours passed, James started picking up bits of conversation. One guy complained about how the schedule never gave him enough time to rest. Another muttered about broken equipment that hadn't been repaired in months. A young woman nearby coughed repeatedly, clutching her side as she struggled to lift a heavy crate. James watched her closely, concern etched on his face. She looked pale, her movements slow and labored. When she finally set the box down, he approached her cautiously. "Hey," he said softly, trying not to startle her. "Are you okay?" She glanced up, surprised by the question. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether to answer honestly. Then, after a pause, she whispered, "Not really. I've been sick for days, but I can't afford to miss work." Her words lingered in James's mind long after she turned back to her task. He couldn't believe someone would come to work while unwell simply because they feared losing income. Back in his corner office, he'd always assumed employees had access to sick leave and support systems. Clearly, that wasn't the reality for everyone. As the day wore on, James continued observing. He noticed how some supervisors barked orders without offering help, how breaks were rushed, and how mistakes were met with harsh criticism rather than guidance. It was clear that something was deeply wrong here. By the time his shift ended, James's feet ached and his back was sore. But more than physical exhaustion, he felt weighed down by what he'd seen. This wasn't just a logistical operation, it was a human story unfolding right in front of him. And he knew this was only the beginning. Little did he know the worst was yet to come. The next few days at the warehouse were a whirlwind of activity. James, still going by his alias Jake, was learning the ropes quickly. Sorting inventory, loading pallets onto trucks, and scanning barcodes became part of his daily routine. At first glance, everything seemed normal. The place was busy, sure, but that wasn't unusual for a logistics hub processing thousands of orders every day. However, as James spent more time among the workers, he began to notice cracks in the system, cracks that ran deeper than he'd anticipated. On Tuesday morning, James arrived early again, just like everyone else. The air inside the warehouse was chilly, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Workers shuffled in with tired eyes, clutching thermoses of coffee or energy drinks. Some greeted each other with quick nods, while others stayed silent, focused on surviving another long shift. James tried to blend in, keeping his head down and working steadily, but it didn't take long for him to realize that not all employees were treated equally. Supervisors moved through the aisles like shadows, their presence casting an uneasy vibe over the floor. They barked orders without explanation, often interrupting tasks midstream to demand faster results. One supervisor in particular stood out. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a booming voice that could cut through the noise of machinery. His name badge read Foreman, though no one called him that. Everyone referred to him simply as the boss. He had a way of making people flinch when he approached, even if he wasn't yelling, at least not yet. It was during the afternoon rush that James witnessed something that made his stomach churn. A young woman nearby was struggling to keep up with her workload. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn. Every time she bent down to pick up a box, she winced slightly as if the movement caused her pain. Despite this, she pushed forward, determined not to fall behind. James couldn't ignore it anymore. When the foreman disappeared into the office, for a moment he walked over to her. "Hey," he said quietly, trying not to draw attention. "Are you doing okay?" She glanced up, startled by the question. For a second she hesitated, clearly unsure whether to trust him. Then, lowering her voice, she admitted, "Not really. I've been feeling sick all week, got a fever and everything. But I can't afford to miss work." Her honesty hit James hard. Back in his executive suite, he'd always assumed policies like paid sick leave were being followed to the letter. Now, standing here in scuffed sneakers and a faded polo shirt, he realized how wrong he'd been. This woman wasn't just dealing with illness. She was fighting against fear. Fear of losing income, fear of being penalized, fear of retaliation. Before James could respond, the foreman's voice boomed across the warehouse. "Pick up the pace, people. We're falling behind schedule." The young woman flinched visibly, then hurried back to her station without another word. James watched her go, his jaw tightening. Something about this situation felt deeply unfair. Why should someone have to choose between their health and their paycheck? Later that day, James decided to test the waters. During a short break, he joined a group of workers huddled near the water cooler. They were sharing stories about their weekends, laughing despite the fatigue etched on their faces. Slowly, James eased into the conversation, asking casual questions about their jobs. One older worker who looked like he'd been with the company for years sighed heavily. "It's not what it used to be," he muttered. "Back in the day, we had more flexibility. Now if you're 5 minutes late or need a day off, they'll come down on you like a ton of bricks." Another chimed in, shaking his head. "And don't get me started on the equipment. Half the machines are broken, but God forbid you say anything. Last guy who complained got written up for causing trouble." James listened intently, nodding along as if he understood. These weren't isolated complaints. They were symptoms of a much larger problem. It was becoming clear that the pressure to meet quotas came at a steep cost: employee morale, safety, and dignity. By Wednesday, James had seen enough to confirm his suspicions. The warehouse operated like a machine, but its gears were grinding too fast, wearing down the very people who kept it running. Still, nothing prepared him for what happened later that afternoon. As the team worked tirelessly to load shipments onto trucks, tension simmered beneath the surface. Mistakes were bound to happen under such relentless conditions, and when they did, the consequences were swift and harsh. A middle-aged man accidentally dropped a crate, spilling its contents onto the floor. The foreman stormed over immediately, his face red with anger. "What's wrong with you?" he snapped, pointing a finger inches from the man's face. "You think we pay you to mess around? Clean this up now and consider yourself lucky I don't dock your pay." The man stammered an apology, his hands trembling as he scrambled to gather the scattered items. Around them, other workers froze, pretending not to notice. No one dared to speak up, not even James. That evening, as James clocked out and headed to his car, he replayed the day's events in his mind. The young woman battling illness, the older worker reminiscing about better days, the man humiliated in front of his peers. It all added up to a picture that disturbed him deeply. He knew there was more to uncover, but already he felt a growing sense of responsibility. These weren't just employees. They were human beings, each carrying their own struggles and sacrifices. And somewhere along the line, the leadership of Apex Logistics had failed them. Driving home, James resolved to dig deeper. Whatever it took, he would expose the truth and make sure things changed for the better. But little did he know, the worst was still ahead. By Thursday, James, still undercover as Jake, was starting to piece together a disturbing pattern. The warehouse wasn't just a place where people worked, it was a pressure cooker, and the foreman was the one turning up the heat. Every shift felt like a test of endurance, with workers scrambling to meet impossible demands while dodging verbal lashings from their supervisors. James had observed enough by now to know that fear ruled this floor. Fear of making mistakes, fear of speaking up, fear of asking for help. It wasn't just about getting the job done, it was about survival, and no one embodied that toxic culture more than the foreman. The breaking point came mid-morning when the young woman who'd confided in James earlier approached the foreman hesitantly. She looked nervous, clutching a clipboard tightly against her chest. From where he stood stacking boxes, James could see her lips moving, though he couldn't hear what she was saying. Whatever it was, it didn't sit well with the foreman. His booming voice cut through the hum of activity like a siren. "What do you mean you can't lift heavy stuff today?" he barked, loud enough for everyone within earshot to hear. "You think you're special? Everyone else is doing their job just fine." The woman took a step back, visibly shrinking under his glare. Her face flushed red, and she stammered, I'm not feeling well. I've been sick since Monday, but I didn't want to miss work. Can I maybe do something lighter today?" Instead of showing even a hint of empathy, the foreman leaned closer, invading her personal space. His tone turned icy. "Lighter duties? You think we're running a charity here? If you can't handle your responsibilities, maybe we should reconsider keeping you around." A collective silence fell over the warehouse. Workers pretended to focus on their tasks, avoiding eye contact. No one dared to intervene, not because they didn't care, but because they knew better. Speaking up would only invite trouble. James clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He wanted to say something, to defend her, but he forced himself to stay quiet. Blowing his cover now would ruin everything. Still, watching the scene unfold left a bitter taste in his mouth. This wasn't leadership, it was bullying. Plain and simple. The young woman mumbled an apology and hurried back to her station, shoulders slumped in defeat. James noticed the way her hands trembled as she picked up another box. She was clearly struggling, but there was no escape. In this environment, weakness wasn't tolerated. It was punished. Later that afternoon, James found himself working alongside a middle-aged man who'd been with the company for years. They were loading crates onto a pallet when the conversation turned serious. "You saw what happened earlier, right?" the man asked in a low voice, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. James nodded. "Yeah, that was rough." The man shook his head, his expression grim. "That's how it always is with him. He doesn't care if you're sick or hurt. All he cares about is hitting those numbers. If you don't keep up, he'll threaten you with pay cuts, or worse, termination." James frowned. "Doesn't anyone report him?" The man let out a humorless laugh. "Who's gonna listen? HR, management? Nah, they'll just side with him. Besides, most folks are too scared to speak up. One wrong move and you're out of here. Jobs aren't easy to come by these days." As the day wore on, James noticed more examples of the foreman's behavior. A new employee accidentally scanned the wrong barcode, causing a minor delay. Instead of offering guidance, the foreman launched into a tirade, calling him incompetent and warning him not to mess things up again. Another worker tripped over a loose cable, spilling tools across the floor. The foreman didn't ask if the person was okay. He simply ordered them to clean it up immediately, muttering something about careless idiots. Each incident chipped away at James's patience. He'd spent decades building Apex Logistics, believing he'd created a company that valued its employees. But now, standing in the trenches, he realized how far removed he'd become from reality. That evening, after clocking out, James sat in his car replaying the day's events in his mind. He thought about the young woman who'd been too afraid to take a sick day, about the seasoned worker who warned him against speaking up, about the countless others who endured mistreatment in silence. It wasn't just the foreman's actions. It was the system that allowed them to happen. Somewhere along the line, priorities had shifted. Efficiency had become more important than humanity. Numbers mattered more than people. But James wasn't ready to give up yet. If anything, he felt more determined than ever to expose the truth. Tomorrow was his last day undercover, and he planned to use it wisely. Driving home, he made a silent promise to himself, and to the workers he'd met, to make things right, no matter what it took. Little did he know, fate had one final confrontation, waiting for him. Friday morning arrived with a heaviness in the air. James woke up earlier than usual, his mind racing with thoughts of what he'd uncovered so far. He knew this was his last day undercover, and he couldn't leave without finding concrete evidence of the problems plaguing the warehouse. It wasn't enough to just witness the foreman's cruelty or hear employees' complaints. He needed proof. Proof that would force change from the top down. As he pulled into the parking lot, James noticed something different about the atmosphere. The usual buzz of activity seemed quieter, almost tense. Workers moved quickly but cautiously, their eyes darting toward the office where the foreman spent most of his time. Something big was brewing, though James couldn't quite put his finger on it yet. Once inside, James clocked in and joined the others at his station. His task for the day was straightforward: assist with inventory checks. But as he worked, he kept an ear out for any conversations that might reveal more about the inner workings of the warehouse. It didn't take long before he overheard two workers whispering near a stack of crates. One of them glanced around nervously before speaking. "Did you hear? They're talking about cutting overtime pay again," he muttered. "Said it's unnecessary expenses." The other worker shook his head in disbelief. "Unnecessary? What are we supposed to do if they don't pay us for the extra hours? We're already stretched thin as it is." James froze for a moment, pretending to adjust a box while listening intently. This wasn't just poor management, it was deliberate manipulation. Cutting overtime pay would only make life harder for these workers, forcing them to choose between putting food on the table and staying healthy. Later that afternoon, James spotted an opportunity he hadn't expected. While helping organize documents in the supervisor's office, a task assigned to him by one of the lower-level managers, he stumbled upon a folder labeled Internal Reports. Curiosity got the better of him, and he flipped it open carefully, scanning the contents. What he found made his blood run cold. The folder contained falsified safety inspections, showing equipment as fully functional when it clearly wasn't. There were emails discussing how to suppress employee complaints along with instructions to avoid documenting incidents unless absolutely necessary. Worst of all, there were payroll records revealing discrepancies. Employees being docked pay for minor infractions like arriving late or taking extended breaks, even when those infractions weren't justified. James felt sick to his stomach. These weren't isolated mistakes. They were systemic issues designed to maximize profits at the expense of human dignity. The foreman wasn't acting alone. He was part of a larger network of corruption within middle management. Knowing he couldn't risk being caught snooping, James snapped a few photos of the documents with his phone, careful not to draw attention. He returned the folder to its original spot and went back to work, his mind reeling with what he'd discovered. As the day wore on, James became increasingly aware of how deeply ingrained the toxic culture was. During a routine inspection, he watched another worker get singled out by the foreman for allegedly slacking off. The accusation was baseless. The worker had been working nonstop for hours. But that didn't stop the foreman from launching into a tirade. "You think I'm blind?" the foreman shouted, his voice echoing through the warehouse. "I see everything. If you can't keep up, maybe you don't deserve to be here." The worker stood frozen, too intimidated to defend himself. Around them, others pretended not to notice, focusing on their tasks to avoid becoming the next target. James clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to intervene. He reminded himself why he was here, to gather as much information as possible before revealing his true identity. Still, watching the fear and humiliation etched on the worker's face left a deep impression on him. By evening, James had pieced together a clearer picture of the situation. The foreman was a symptom of a much larger disease, a culture of exploitation that prioritized profit over people. Employees were treated like disposable cogs in a machine, replaceable and expendable. As he clocked out for the final time, James took one last look around the warehouse. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on tired faces. For a brief moment, he wondered how many of these workers had families waiting for them at home. How many struggled to make ends meet because of unfair policies? How many came to work every day despite feeling unwell, knowing they had no other choice? Driving home, James felt a mix of anger and determination. He had promised himself, and the workers he'd met, that he wouldn't let this go unnoticed. Tomorrow he would step out of the shadows and confront the truth head-on. But first he needed a plan, a good one. Little did he know, fate had already set the stage for a dramatic showdown. Saturday morning came, and James knew it was time to act. The weight of everything he'd uncovered pressed heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't let another day pass without stepping forward and revealing the truth. This wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about standing up for the people who had no voice. But as he prepared himself mentally, he also knew this wouldn't be easy. James arrived at the warehouse earlier than usual, dressed in his disguise once again. He didn't want to raise suspicion before making his move. As he walked through the familiar aisles, the hum of machinery and chatter of workers filled the air. Everything seemed normal, on the surface at least. The first few hours passed uneventfully. James focused on his tasks, keeping a low profile while waiting for the right moment. Then, around mid-morning, the foreman appeared in the middle of the floor, barking orders louder than ever. It was clear he was in one of his moods, looking for someone to pick on. That's when it happened. A worker, a young man with dark circles under his eyes and hands trembling slightly from fatigue, accidentally dropped a box of fragile items. The crash echoed through the warehouse, drawing everyone's attention. The foreman stormed over immediately, his face red with rage. "What is wrong with you?" the foreman yelled, towering over the worker. "Do you have any idea how much that shipment cost? Maybe we should just take it out of your paycheck," the young man stammered, clearly overwhelmed. I'm sorry. I've been working non-stop since yesterday and my hands, they're shaking. I didn't mean to." "Excuses," the foreman interrupted, cutting him off. "If you can't handle the job, maybe you shouldn't be here." The room fell silent. Workers exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. No one wanted to draw the foreman's wrath onto themselves. James stood nearby, watching the scene unfold. His heart raced, torn between staying undercover and stepping in. But something inside him snapped. He couldn't stay silent anymore. Not after everything he'd seen. "That's enough," James said firmly, stepping forward. His voice carried authority, cutting through the tension like a knife. The foreman turned to glare at him, visibly annoyed. "Who do you think you are, telling me what to do?" For a moment, James hesitated. This was it, the point of no return. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his glasses and looked directly at the foreman. Everyone froze, their eyes widening in shock as they realized who this unassuming worker really was. "I'm James Whitaker," he announced, his tone steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, "and I've seen enough." The silence that followed was deafening. Workers exchanged looks of disbelief, whispering among themselves. Some stared at James in awe, while others seemed unsure whether to trust their ears. The foreman, however, looked like he'd been punched in the gut. What are you doing here?" the foreman sputtered, his bravado crumbling. "I came here to see what life is really like for the people who keep this company running," James replied, his voice calm but firm. "And what I've found is unacceptable. Threatening employees, falsifying reports, exploiting hardworking people, it stops today." The foreman tried to recover, sputtering excuses. "Sir, I was just following protocol. These guys need discipline or they'll slack off." "Enough," James interrupted, raising a hand to silence him. "There's no excuse for treating people this way. You're fired, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like thunder. The foreman opened his mouth to protest, but James wasn't finished. "And don't think you're the only one responsible for this mess," he continued, addressing the rest of the supervisors gathered nearby. "This toxic culture didn't start with you. It's been allowed to fester because of weak leadership and unchecked greed. That ends now." The workers erupted into murmurs, some clapping quietly while others simply stared in stunned silence. For many of them, this felt like a dream or perhaps a nightmare come true. They never imagined seeing their CEO walk among them, let alone call out the injustices they faced daily. James turned to the crowd, his expression softening. "To all of you, I owe you an apology. You deserve better than what you've been given. Better pay, safer conditions, and leaders who respect you. From this day forward, things will change, I promise you that." He paused, scanning the faces of the workers. Many of them looked skeptical, their years of distrust too deep to vanish overnight. But a few nodded slowly, hope flickering in their eyes. Before leaving, James pulled aside the young man who had dropped the box earlier. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. The worker nodded, still shaken but grateful. "Thank you, sir. I didn't know what to do." "You did nothing wrong," James assured him. "Take tomorrow off if you need to rest. And don't worry about your paycheck. We'll make sure you're taken care of." As James walked out of the warehouse, he felt both relief and resolve. Relief that he had finally confronted the truth, and resolve to ensure real change took root. But he knew this was only the beginning. Little did he know, the hardest part was yet to come. The fallout from James's dramatic reveal spread like wildfire. By Monday morning, news of the undercover CEO's visit had reached every corner of Apex Logistics. Employees buzzed with excitement and disbelief, sharing stories about how Jake Miller had turned out to be none other than James Whitaker himself. For some, it was a moment of vindication. For others, cautious optimism. But one thing was certain. Change was coming. James wasted no time. He called an emergency meeting with senior management, presenting the evidence he'd gathered during his week undercover, the falsified safety reports, manipulated payroll records, and emails detailing deliberate suppression of employee complaints painted a damning picture. It became clear that the foreman wasn't acting alone. He was part of a toxic chain of command that prioritized profits over people. Within hours, disciplinary actions were taken. The foreman and several other supervisors involved in unethical practices were terminated immediately. Internal investigations were launched at all warehouse locations to root out similar issues. James made it clear that this wasn't just about punishing individuals, it was about dismantling a broken system, but firing bad actors was only the first step. James knew real change required more than just removing problematic leaders. It meant rebuilding trust and creating an environment where employees felt valued, respected, and safe. Over the next few weeks, James rolled out sweeping reforms across the company. First, he introduced anonymous reporting channels so workers could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Then, he implemented mandatory leadership training programs focused on empathy, communication, and fair treatment. Supervisors were now required to undergo regular evaluations based not just on productivity, but also on their ability to foster positive relationships with their teams. One of the most impactful changes came in the form of improved benefits. Paid sick leave policies were strengthened, ensuring employees wouldn't have to choose between their health and their livelihoods. Over time, pay discrepancies were addressed, and bonuses were introduced for those who consistently went above and beyond. Broken equipment was repaired promptly, and new safety protocols were put in place to prevent accidents. To ensure accountability, James appointed a task force made up of both employees and external consultants. Their job was to monitor progress and provide feedback directly to him. This initiative gave workers a sense of ownership over the changes, empowering them to shape the future of the company. Among those who benefited most was the young woman who had confided in James during his Undercover stint. Her courage in speaking up inspired James to promote her to assistant manager. Tasked with helping rebuild morale among the workforce, she brought fresh energy and ideas to the role, advocating passionately for her colleagues and earning their trust. Months later, the transformation at Apex Logistics was undeniable. Employee satisfaction surveys showed a significant improvement, with workers praising the newfound transparency and support. Productivity increased, not because of threats or pressure, but because employees felt motivated to give their best effort. The warehouse itself underwent physical changes too. Brighter lighting replaced the harsh fluorescence, and break rooms were renovated to create welcoming spaces for rest and connection. Even small touches, like free coffee and healthier snack options, made a big difference in boosting morale. James often reflected on his undercover experience, grateful for the lessons it taught him. Before, he'd relied on data and reports to understand the state of his company. Now he realized that true insight came from walking in someone else's shoes, from seeing the world through the eyes of the people who kept his business running. At an annual company-wide meeting, James stood before thousands of employees, many of whom watched via livestream. His speech was simple yet heartfelt. "When I started this journey, I thought I knew what it meant to lead," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I quickly learned that leadership isn't about numbers or bottom lines, it's about people. You are the heart of Apex Logistics, and without you, none of our success would be possible." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I'm sorry for failing you," he continued, "for allowing a culture of fear and exploitation to take root, but I promise you this: we will never let it happen again. Together we'll build a workplace where everyone feels respected, supported, and valued." The room erupted in applause, a mixture of cheers and tears. Workers hugged each other, sharing smiles of relief and hope. For the first time in years, they believed in the promise of a better tomorrow. In the months that followed, Apex Logistics earned recognition for its improved workplace culture. Industry publications praised the company's commitment to ethical practices and employee well-being. Customers noticed the difference too, with faster delivery times and higher quality service reflecting the renewed dedication of the team. James didn't stop there. He became an advocate for corporate responsibility, speaking at conferences and sharing his story to inspire other leaders to prioritize their employees. He often reminded audiences of a simple truth: a company is only as strong as the people who power it. Looking back, James knew his decision to go undercover had been risky, but it had also been worth it. It wasn't just about fixing problems, it was about rediscovering why he started Apex Logistics in the first place. At its core, The company wasn't about profits or logistics, it was about people. And sometimes the most powerful way to lead was by listening.